Currently, our JWT authentication server supports user registration, logging in to get a JWT access token and refresh token, and also refreshing an expired access token. And those are really the essentials for a JWT authentication server. But what if a user's access token gets stolen? Well, that's not really that big of a deal because the access token is going to expire in 30 minutes. So once those 30 minutes are up, the user that stole the access token isn't going to be able to do anything else unless they also stole the user's refresh token, which doesn't expire for what I believe is 3 months that we have here in minutes. And if they stole the refresh token, then they're going to be able to constantly refresh the expired access token and just completely hijack the original user's account. So what we are going to do is give users a way to invalidate all of their refresh tokens so that if one of their refresh tokens does get stolen or they suspect it got stolen, they can invalidate all of them, and the person that stole the refresh token isn't going to be able to constantly refresh and get a new access token and ruin everything. So we're going to consider this logging out. So when you log out, it's going to invalidate all of your refresh tokens. So it's going to be a post request to the logout route, and let's create a handler for that, an iAction result called logout, and we're actually not going to get anything in the body of this request. And that might be surprising because how are we going to figure out what user we want to invalidate refresh tokens for? Well, what we're going to do is authenticate the user. So we'll add an authorized attribute to this route, which means the user is going to hit this route with their access token. And as we recall, we signed the user's ID into the access token, so we can grab that ID and we'll know the user that we're dealing with. So as we recall with the data server, we actually demonstrated how we can pull that ID out of the validated JWT. So we did that in our home controller. Here we go. So the claims are all put into the HTTP context user, and we can use find first value with the ID claim type. So I'm actually going to copy this and paste that here. So now we have the user's ID that we want to invalidate refresh tokens for. Now this is actually a GUID, but it's stored as a string in our claims. So I do want to actually parse this to a GUID. So we'll use GUID.tryParse, the ID, and we'll output that to a new GUID. We'll call this user ID. And in fact, I'm going to rename this to raw user ID. So raw as in unparsed. And now if this parsing fails, so we'll put that in the if statement, we're going to return unauthorized, because that means there must be some kind of invalid ID, and we just simply can't authorize the user. But now that we have this user ID, we know the user and we can invalidate all of the refresh tokens. So how are we going to invalidate those refresh tokens? Well, if we take a look at our refresh action, we see a refresh token is invalid if we can't find it in the refresh token repository. So that means to invalidate a refresh token, we're simply just going to delete it from our data store using our refresh token repository. So let's go into our refresh token repository, and we're going to have another method here. And of course we want to invalidate all of a user's refresh tokens. So I'm going to call this delete all, and it's going to take the user's ID. And let's implement that in our actual in-memory refresh token repository. So here we'll take our refresh tokens and remove all the refresh tokens where the user ID on the refresh token equals the user ID that we want to delete for. And then we'll just return task completed task. And now back on our controller, all we have to do is use our refresh token repository and delete all refresh tokens and pass in the user's ID that we want to delete refresh tokens for. And once that is done, that's really all we need to do, so we can return no content. And now that I think about it, this should really be an HTTP delete, because we are deleting refresh tokens. That makes more sense. So one thing to note is that we are now using this authorized attribute, which means we need to set up authentication on our authentication server. So we did actually already set this up in our data server. We have our add authentication, and we use our token validation parameters. So we just need to use this in our authentication server. So I'm actually just going to copy it real quick and paste that in here. And we actually don't need to do all this binding because we already have our authentication configuration loaded up here. So we can get rid of that. Just setting up the token validation parameters, and then we need JWT bearer default. So we're going to have to install that package, Microsoft.ASP.NET Core authentication JWT bearer. So add that, import all these using statements. And before we forget, we also have to use authentication and use authorization. So add that middleware in that order. Order is important. Alright, so I logged in, got my access token and refresh token. So now let's use this refresh token. So head over to the refresh route, pass that through the body, and refresh token's all good, and I get another refresh token. Now let's say something bad happened, my refresh token got stolen, so I want to invalidate this refresh token. So what I'm going to do is take my access token, I'll duplicate one of these tabs, we're going to do a delete request to the logout route, and we have to pass our access token through the headers, so we'll use the authorization key, and this is a bearer token, so we'll prefix it with bearer, paste in the access token, and now we're going to log out. We hit a breakpoint. Let's walk through this. So we get the user ID, we parse it to a GUID, we're going to delete all refresh tokens for a user by ID, so we do that, and now we return no content, gives us back a 204 status code. That's all good. So this did indeed work. Let's go ahead and try and use our refresh token. So I will copy this token and paste it in here and send that, and we now have an invalid refresh token. So that means whoever stole this token is not going to be able to hijack my account forever and ruin my life or any other user's life. So in my opinion, that is the best approach for handling stolen refresh tokens. Simply invalidate them by deleting all of them from the database for a specific user. And you might be thinking, well, wouldn't it be nice if we could invalidate access tokens? Because I suppose a user could do a lot of damage if they stole an access token and they had 30 minutes to just do whatever they wanted. And this is really hard to manage in a microservices architecture. So really, one of your best choices is just making this expiration time shorter. But still, if that's not good enough, I have seen some instances where people set up a blacklist for access tokens. So a user could send a post request with their access token that they think got stolen, and it would put that access token in some kind of blacklist. So if anyone else tried to authenticate with that access token, it simply would not work. But that's a little bit advanced, and I think it's outside the scope of this tutorial. For now, I think it's good enough. Just have a short expiration time on the access token and give users a way to invalidate their refresh tokens. So that is the final addition to our JWT authentication server. We give users a way to log out, invalidate all of their refresh tokens by deleting them from the database, and now we support user registration, logging in to get an access token and refresh token, refreshing expired access tokens, and logging out. So I believe that's everything I want to cover for this series. If you enjoyed, be sure to leave a like or subscribe for more, and stay tuned for, of course, the bonus videos.